Good evening. My name is Scott Kratz. I am the Vice President for Education here at the National Building Museum. And tonight we present a program entitled Vertical Farming to discuss the future of how and where we produce our food, how that food travels to our dinner plates, and the important role of production and transportation that food plays in how our cities look and function. Everyone eats, but how many of us think more than a fleeting few seconds about food and its impact on the built environment? Stop for a minute and think about what you had for breakfast. Maybe like me, you had cereal. Okay, consider the vast plains in America's breadbasket where that wheat was grown and the water, land, and fertilizer that was needed to produce those grains that ended up, in my case, as Trader Joe's Vanilla Almond Crunch. And maybe like you, maybe like me, you like blueberries on top of your cereal. Consider that the average produce in American supermarkets travels 1,500 miles to get there. Those blueberries actually, in my case, I have to admit, originated in Chile, a little more than 1,500 miles away, 5,000 miles away, most likely flown into the U.S. Those tiny blueberries are incredibly tasty, but they have a huge carbon footprint. And finally, most of us enjoy milk in our cereal. Milk comes from cows, and cows drink a lot of water. Milk is 87% water after all, and a lactating dairy cow, you might not have known this, has one of the largest requirements for water of any animal, between 30 and 50 gallons a day. Water is a precious resource and must be shared with new developments, industry, and of course, all of our needs inside of our homes. The point of me saying this is that what we eat plays an enormous role in land use, transportation, infrastructure, climate change, and our health. What if, sometime in the not-so-distant future, we could grow our wheat, blueberries, and even our dairy cows in a 35-story building in downtown Silver Spring? Would that be a good thing? Or what happens if we created an emerald necklace of urban gardens in our city centers? Tonight, we've assembled a very impressive group of speakers from a range of backgrounds and disciplines to discuss these same issues with us tonight. Experts in the fields of architecture, planning, landscape architecture, and public health, and I look forward to an in-depth and thoughtful discussion. We must thank our funders of this series. The For the Greener Good series is presented by the museum's sustainability partner, the Home Depot Foundation, and we would like to thank them for their generous support of this innovative lecture series. And programs such as tonight's have been designed to incorporate your thoughts and questions. They are meant to be conversational in format. I recognize many faces that are out in the audience, so you've been to some of these programs before. So you'll know that we'll break periodically to take questions from the audience. And before we begin, I've given each of the panelists a general idea of who we found in the audience. But it'll help to give them an idea of who they're speaking to. By a show of hands, can I ask how many architects are in the audience? Great. Planners? Wonderful. Landscape architects? Great. Engineers? Wonderful. Journalists? Wonderful. Students? Great. A lot of students with us tonight. Federal or state employees? Boy, that's great. A really nice mix. Well, we have quite a panel for you this evening. Let me give the quickest of introductions to everyone so we can get right into the dialogue. Carolyn Steel is an architect, lecturer, and writer. Since graduating from Cambridge University, she's combined architectural practice with teaching and research into the everyday lives of cities, running design studios at London Metropolitan University and at Cambridge, where her lecture course, Food and the City, is an established part of the degree program. As director of Cullum and Nightingale Architects, she was a Rome scholar, has written for the Architectural Press, and is the author of a fantastic book that I encourage you all to read, Hungry City, How Food Shapes Our Lives, which is available, signed copies, I should say, are available in the museum shop. Robin Elmslie Osler established EOA, Elmslie Osler Architects, in 1996. She attended Kenyon College, Tyler School of Art, and received her Bachelor of Science in Architecture from the University of Virginia in 1987. She was admitted to the Masters of Architecture program at Yale University with advanced standing and received her degree in 1990. In 1989, she was awarded a fellowship from the American Association of University Women. She's held faculty positions at Parsons School of Design, Yale University, Pratt Institute, and City College of the City of New York. And she's also the designed, which we're going to hear more about tonight, these amazing farms in Los Angeles' Skid Row that are absolutely stunning. Dickson Despommier is a professor of public health at Columbia University. He's a microbiologist and ecologist by training. He's been working on globally relevant projects that address issues of agriculture, as growing food is solely responsible for so much of the environmental impact on this planet. One area of focus has been how to raise food without further encroachment into natural ecosystems. He established the Vertical Farm at verticalfarm.com as a theoretical construct to look at the possibility of agricultural sustainability within cities. The idea grew out of a class project to measure the effects of rooftop gardening in New York City on reducing the dome of heat that develops over each of us each year. From that original idea, he expanded the concept to include urban architecture and finally to multi-story indoor farming. And our moderator this evening is J. William Thompson, who is the editor-in-chief of Landscape Architecture magazine, a writer and editor who has been with the magazine since 1988. He became editor-in-chief in 1990. He's introduced critical commentary into the magazine and has sparked greatly increased letters to the editor with his monthly Land Matters editorial. A prolific writer.
That's good. That's good.
Is that good?
That's perfect.
Okay. Bill lives right here in Washington, D.C. With that, please welcome Bill and the rest of the panel.
Great. Well, let's get started. Carolyn, let me start with you. I seem to have a little echo effect here, but when everyone walked in, we saw green skyscrapers superimposed on the screen there. That seems like an extreme solution to growing food. Why has the time come? Has the time come to consider extreme solutions, and if so, why?
Well, I think the time absolutely has come, and I think it is also an extreme solution, actually. So, in a sense, that sort of frames the problem for me, which has really existed for mankind for roughly 10,000 years. Which is basically, if you build something that we shall loosely term a city, and choose to live in it, you're automatically displacing where you live from where your food comes from. And I think this is a problem that we can see very clearly if we look at the ancient city. You know, the entire infrastructure of the city and the way it was organized was predicated around the food supply. You know, this is an enormous problem. How do you feed urban populations? That's always been with us since we started building cities. The only difference now is that instead of 3% of people in the global population, as it was the case in 1800, living in something you might even remotely call a city, in other words, some kind of dwelling, that, you know, sort of community that had more than 5,000 people in it. Now, as we know, we've got half the planet living in something we call a city. And a further projected 3 billion to be living in them in 2050. So, I mean, what I call the urban paradox, which is that although we live in cities, we're still animals with animal needs, hasn't gone away. But it's just the scale of the problem now is such that actually if we carry on trying to feed ourselves as we currently do, we're going to trash the planet long before we get to 2050. So, for me, vertical farms is a very, very powerful if you like, indicator of sort of focus of a much, much bigger problem that needs addressing.
Let me just follow up. You said if we keep producing food the way you're producing it now, right, we're going to trash the planet. Could you just
well, I
that
mean,
out
just
for us?
The stats are astonishing, but I mean, you know, something like 95% of the food we produce globally now is oil dependent. I don't know whether the audience has heard of peak oil, but, you know, this is stuff we're about to run out of. Something like 4 million hectares of land. No, it is actually billion, sorry. Hectares of tropical rainforest are being destroyed every year to produce farmland. And the way we farm in order to produce this stuff that we call cheap food, but in fact is not cheap because there's no such thing as cheap food. It's only cheap if its costs are externalized. we're only managing to produce this stuff by having these enormous monocultural productive units, whether it's corn that we're growing or beef, that is basically trashing the soil, and it's literally destroying the ecosystems that have sustained the planet for millions of years in the case of just a few decades. So it's the methods of production that we've resorted to in order to solve a problem, which is an enormous problem, that's really sort of unfolded in a way that's sort of invisible to people that actually consume the food. You know, it's not that the people consuming their cereal in the morning are evil or anything, but actually unwittingly we're sort of furthering a system that's deeply unsustainable, very often without realizing it. So I think it is the scale of the problem and the invisibility of it that really we're going to be addressing tonight.
So, from talking to the three of you just before we started, I got the sense that all three of you advocate bringing food much closer to the consumer.
Absolutely.
Food production much closer to the consumer. Please tell us how that's really going to help with the problem, solve the problem.
Well, we have different approaches.
Why don't you start with your approach?
Well, our approach is actually starting at a fairly small scale and taking it to the streets. Because one of the things that concerns me and the people that I work with is that a lot of the discussion, at least within the architectural community, about vertical farming, there are a lot of really beautiful images and they're very evocative, but they all seem to be these very large-scale, aggressive,
expensive.
Some of them are very elegant, but I think what's getting lost in the conversation is the people that actually need it the most, which are the people that are disenfranchised, the people that are living on the streets, single parents that are struggling with, 1, 2, 3 children, healthcare costs, elderly people, or anybody living on a fixed income. A lot of these people live in neighborhoods where healthy local food is either unavailable or it's unaffordable. And so our project actually aims to bring that access to that kind of food to those kinds of people. And it's actually a system that is, the pilot project is in Los Angeles, but our intention is to take it across the country.
Tell us a bit more what it is.
Yeah, it's called the Urban Farming Food Chain, and it's a collaboration between my office and an organization called Urban Farming, which is based in Detroit. And it started with the founder of the organization coming to my office. Her name's Taja Seville. And we were working on a project for designing a store for anthropology in Huntsville, Alabama. And we were installing, at that point, I think it still is, the largest living wall in North America on the store facade. It's about 2,000 square feet, but it's all sedum. And it's using a system of trays. They're 2 feet by 2 feet. They have cells in them. It's a really super simple system. Literally, they clip onto a horizontal rail. They lock into each other. There are cuts in the cells that allow water to drip down and irrigate the plants. There's a gutter at the bottom. It's a closed-loop system. It's very, very simple. She saw the model of this project in our office. She said, well, can you grow food on that? And I said, well, I don't know. Let's check. Let's find out. So we found out we could. At that point, I said, you don't need an architect to grow food on the wall. I'll hook you up with the supplier. You guys can do your thing. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. Maybe I can make this into something more compelling. Maybe if I can bring architecture to the table, I can make this into a more cohesive project that actually had some legs to it. So I basically sat down and I wrote a program, and it's based on Frederick Law Olmsted's Emerald Necklace in Boston.
What better?
Yeah. The classic. And it is comprised of the providers, which are the walls that grow food, the guardians, which are the guardian boxes, which are a series of containers that are attached to the wall next to the food. They contain small gardening tools. It's also a way to identify the project. It's also a way to display donors' names, and we're trying to be very careful about not making it into like a billboard. And then what I call the heart, which would be a series of kitchens which would be inserted into storefronts throughout the cities. And this would be a place where we would have collaborations with local chefs, get them involved to come down to these kitchens and teach the people from the streets how to make healthy food with the food they get from the walls.
And a prototype has been put up in where?
We're doing it piece by piece. The walls went up in Los Angeles last August. There is a wall at 2 in Skid Row, both at shelters. There's one at a school, and there's one at the local food bank. And the idea is I see it as a self-sustaining system, a circle, so to speak, we've already started to see unbelievable benefits, but it's something that it's not to stay just in one city. The idea is to be able to identify these links in the chain, not only within the city, but also across the country. So you may go to St. Louis and you see these yellow boxes and that yellow kitchen. It's all made out of recycled material. So that, too, is an identifier. We're trying to use materials. We're trying to use everything is linked to create a memory for people that, this is part of that system. So
that seems like a relatively low-tech, easily replicable system. Dickson, you have a somewhat different idea. What's your idea?
Well, I wouldn't call it a different idea. I would call it a different scale of an idea. I think the project that we represent is a futuristic project, and it's a project which addresses the following. There are 7 billion people on the planet right now, and we use land mass about the size of Brazil, the size of South America, I should say, to farm. This includes grazing land too. We've got another 3 billion people on the way. I have no qualms about that whatsoever. In fact, I don't think we can do anything about it anyway, even if we did have qualms about it. The fact is that those 3 billion people will have to be fed in a slightly different way than we're feeding the 7 billion people today. Even if you think we're feeding everybody fine the way we are, which we're not, of course, it means that you're going to have to develop something else for the next 3 billion people. Meanwhile, we've got rapid climate change issues to deal with. We've got farming has either failed, will fail, or is failing. If you go around the world, you can see this all over the place. You can see it in India, Southeast Asia, and you can go to places that lots of people live that have no farming whatsoever, like the entire Middle East. So you have those places to address. Inner city Los Angeles is something that I don't think vertical farming would be it would be a spectacular addition to the skylight of Los Angeles, but I don't mean it to be that. What I really want to think about is how can we grow food continuously year-round? How can we save 70% of the water we now squander for outdoor farming? Because indoor farming using hydroponic technologies uses 70% less water than outdoor farming. And water is the most valuable commodity on the planet right now, at least drinking water. So that addresses that issue. How can we avoid crop damage due to severe weather events? I think I'm not meaning to compare vertical farming with walls that are green. I think green walls are fabulous, and outdoor green walls are fabulous, indoor green walls are fabulous. But somehow that doesn't address the scale of the issue of, let's say, to a country like Bangladesh, which last year had a monsoon that was so severe that it eliminated enough soil to feed 2 million people. Now, 2 million people cannot be fed today because of the soil that was washed away by that one monsoon event. And when you have events like that happening in various places throughout the world, it begs a new solution. It means that you can't go back to outdoor farming and expect it to work. So are there examples of indoor farming that produce massive quantities of food that, if we could stack them on top of each other and move them closer to the city, would be a viable alternative to what we now face? And the answer is yes. There are plenty of examples of this now. And in the last 10 years, indoor farming has blossomed in the face of a changing environment. So the indoor environment doesn't change, right? I'll give you one of two choices. You pick it. And same up here. you can control everything. That's choice one. Choice two, you can control nothing. Now, if you pick the latter, you can be a farmer because that's the farmer's plight. I was just speaking with a farmer day before yesterday from Decatur, Illinois, who ran across our website and was fascinated by the concept. And as we began to talk, I said, why don't you just describe what farming means to you? He says, well, I can tell you quite plainly. He says, I have some rich, fertile soil. He says, but in the spring, you take that seed and you put it in the ground and you put water on it and you pray for rain. That's what you do. And they do a lot of praying. And sometimes their prayers are answered and sometimes they're not. Now, if I'm an indoor farmer, I'll pray for something else. Maybe I'll pray I'll win the lottery. But I don't have to pray for rain, and I don't have to pray for the end of a drought, and I don't have to pray for the cessation of locusts attacking my crops. And if I design my indoor farms properly, I can keep out certain plant diseases that are transmitted by insects. There are many of them that are transmitted because the bite of the insect on the plant makes a hole, which then allows a pathogen to gain entrance. So my training is in microbiology, so I know this.
So Dickson, you want to use the existing greenhouse technology and stack it.
That's correct.
How high would these go, and where would you put them?
Tell me how high you would like them. I would put them in desert communities. I mean, I would put them, in fact, one exists right now called Eurofresh. That's a 318-acre indoor hydroponic facility that makes the most delicious tomatoes and cucumbers and things like this. I mean, I agree that that's still 1,500 miles away from, maybe even more, from where I live. And that's the biggest problem, is that you still have to pick it before it's ripe. You have to ship it. And if you do that, probably you have to store it first. You have to package it. And that uses tremendous amounts of energy in terms of fossil fuel. And you get lots of spoilage of crop along the way. And then you have to unpack it. And then you have to sell it. Now, a vertical farm that I imagine, maybe 3 or 4 stories, maybe higher, depends on where you live, would have the greengrocer right on the first floor. So, and you can design these in ways that take advantage of passive energy, like wind and solar and tidal and geothermal. Depends on where you live as to how the energy shakes out in terms of getting this building off the grid. But they don't have to be these giant superstructures that all these architecture people, and I treasure those images, believe me, none of them I asked them to do. They all dropped what they were doing and did one of these for us. And I put it up because I wanted you to see what people are thinking about. But my idea of a vertical farm is something that could be scaled into an individual restaurant or a school or a hospital or on the top of an apartment house, maybe 3 or 4 stories. Something that's reasonable, something that's doable based on our work in a prototype. So the first vertical farm I would produce would be an experimental farm in, let's say, an agriculturally gifted school, let's say like Rutgers University. I live in New Jersey, so that would be a great place to put an experimental vertical farm. Or you take one out to UC Davis, where hydroponic farming was invented, and let them play with it and see what they can come up with. And I can guarantee you that they will come up with modularities and stackabilities and systems integration things which will be totally compatible with scaling up and down in terms of vertical farming. So while these are great images, I would highly recommend something more manageable and more human.
Well, let me pose something really low tech. I have a community garden plot, as I was telling you upstairs. I have a community garden plot in Cleveland Park here in Washington, D.C., where I grow some of my own food. How do these really low tech solutions fit into all these plans that you seem to be sketching out?
Well, I mean, I think we've been talking about this all day, is that for there is an issue of scale here. And I think what Dickson is proposing to get the conversation started, it's sort of like, almost like crying fire in a crowded room. You know, it's sort of like, wake up. It's important that people listen to understand what the problems are, and really take the bull by the horns, and let's come up with some really aggressive solutions. And I think that's really important. But to actually make that happen in the time that it's going to take to make that happen, and that should probably happen, but I think it starts, you probably get a great level of satisfaction from working in that small garden of yours. You know, getting your hands in the dirt, tasting the food, the difference in the flavors. We've talked about terroir before, which is one thing that really concerns me about this scale of farming, and I know hydroponics are supposed to be great, but there is this issue of terroir where, you know, across the world, every soil has a personality, you know, and it's sensitive to the climate and the geology, actually, of history. And you lose that in a lot of these larger scale things. And I know that what I'm interested in, and I understand through the work that we've been doing, and it's directly related to the community garden, is educating people about the difference that growing food locally can make in your life. I mean, there was a student at one of the school that where the wall is. It's the Miguel Contreras Learning Center. It's broken up into different campuses, but the garden is part of the School for Social Justice. It's a high school. It's 95% Latino. It's in downtown Los Angeles. The teacher was telling me a story about this young boy who had never tasted a fresh tomato before. And he really didn't know that they were actually edible because he would see them on his cheeseburger at McDonald's and throw it away because it didn't look edible. And actually it probably wasn't edible. But he took one of these things off of the wall and bit into it like an apple because he didn't know that that's why wouldn't you eat it? It's round, it looks sort of like an apple, it's red. And the flavor completely surprised him. And this has inspired him. He took some home to his family. You know, it's like all of a sudden they start getting interested in making different kinds of meals. It educates the consumer to what their options are. And that has an enormous impact on their health, not only their mental health, but their physical health, which feeds into the healthcare system, which, you know, it keeps going and going and going. And so if we can make the impact on the scale that I'm talking about to begin with, you know, starting with these community gardens, and maybe what happens is that because community gardens are threatened by development, and I think one of the things that I know that we were talking about a lot too was sort of rethinking the concept of how a city is planned. And for you planners out there, it's like, I've missed your presence, you know, in our culture, because I think, you know, I know in my city, I mean, where I live in New York City, it's the developers that are telling the planners and the architects and the landscape architects what to do. And it should be the other way around.
Could I pick up on that, actually? Because I think, I mean, for me, and I did start by saying that, for me, the whole issue comes down to these things we live in, we call cities. And I think the very word needs readdressing, because I think what cities used to be when they first came into being a very long time ago is no longer what they are. And I think, you know, the other thing is the presence of, I mean, you were asking about, you know, do community gardens have an impact in all of this conversation? Absolutely they do. But the problem is that in the historical city, people, if you like, had the benefits of urbanity, but, you know, they were still within a sort of 20-minute walk of what we now call countryside. And the other very interesting thing is that food, which is the product of the natural world and also connects us to nature, does bring extraordinary benefits if one allows it to be natural. And I think this is one of the big issues with vertical farms, is the degree to which, in solving the problem of food production, we don't chuck the baby out with the bathwater. Because for me, you know, the readdressing what a city is also really about sort of readdressing what it is to have a good life on the planet, really. You know, and I think historically there's been a sort of assumption that, you know, cities have all of these benefits of other people to talk to in innovation and creativity and poetry and theatre and whatever. But actually, you know, very often they've become kind of dead factories, you know, sort of no-end places. And actually we're in danger of forgetting that there's a very good life to be lived in a much simpler way, in much closer connection with nature as well. So for me, there are two, well, there's a lot of related issues here, but I would say that there are no big answers to this problem, but there are a lot of little answers. And probably what I would say they all boil down to is man, by which I mean man and woman, mankind and nature, and recalibrating what it is to dwell in that way. So I would like to see people actually questioning what a city is. I think chucking a bit of vertical farm into the middle of it is a radical way of doing that. I think chucking a bit of what we now think of as city into the middle of the country is another interesting way of doing that. I think, the patina of how one brings this connection with nature together can happen at all different scales. So literally, it could be me, as I do at home. I live in the middle of London. I don't have a garden, but I grow herbs on my windowsill. So at that scale, that's a fantastic thing. But it's everything from that sort of very, very micro up to, oh wow, what do we do about the kind of, the amount of Amazonian rainforest being destroyed in order to produce grazing for beef, or even worse, soya for beef.
I'd like to address just one issue here, and that is the taste of greenhouse food. Because I think it's an issue. It was an issue to begin with because the greenhouse industry perceived consumerism as, gee, that looks like a great tomato. I think I'll buy that one. And indeed, they could make tomatoes look perfect. They were all perfect, but they tasted horrible. There was no taste at all. They were mealy. They were awful, right? So if you don't tell them what you want, they won't give it to you. So, you want one that tastes good? Now you tell me. So they went back and examined the issues associated with what makes tomatoes or anything else taste good. And the answer was quite surprising. And I think you'll agree with me that if you were a vintner and you owned your own vineyard, some years you have good years and some years you have bad years because, remember, outdoors you can't control anything. So when you can't control that, you have to figure out what it was that gave you your good wine to begin with, right? And surprisingly enough, the worse off the grapes were, the better off the wine was. They almost died, but they were still alive. And you take a look at those grapes, you wouldn't want to eat one of them. But they made the most fantastic wines. Why? Because they contain some substances they call flavonoids. Flavonoids are what makes your food taste good. So they actually discovered this for the greenhouse industry. So you go to Eurofresh. They've won a tasting contest for tomatoes, by the way, and they were pitted against, no pun intended, all of the other tomatoes that were grown either indoors or outdoors. It didn't matter. This was not a hydroponic tasting contest. This was a tasting contest. So to make it taste good, all you have to do is stress that tomato just before you pick it. And it develops the flavonoids of these outdoor products that some years you get good tomatoes, and outdoors, I live in New Jersey, so I have Jersey tomatoes to use as the example. Some years you get lousy Jersey tomatoes that look great, but the farmers will tell you, we had too much rain this year. The tomatoes grew perfect, but they didn't develop their flavor. Somehow they didn't develop that flavor. So we know how to control that. That's the point. Indoors you control everything, outdoors you control nothing. So learning that lesson allows you to at least overcome one of the objections to hydroponic farming, and that is how does your food taste?
But I would argue that it's not just about the food and how it tastes. I think it's the whole, and this is where we get into our utopian ideas about, but I think there is something to be said for the connection between the farmer and his land, and yes, the inherent struggles, or understanding. What's interesting, what's happened in Los Angeles, because a lot of these people have never seen food, one that looks like the food that's coming off of these walls, because they're used to seeing it, for example, in the Weingart Center, they don't have dining facilities there. So they have to go down the street to a dining hall where they serve 3 meals a day. And you can sort of imagine what that food looks like. It's not at all, things come out of big cans and vats. And granted, it's feeding them, but it's not the same as what's coming off of these walls. And what they're discovering is that what happens if they take care of the soil and what impact that makes on those vegetables or those herbs. They begin to taste the difference. they begin to make these connections between their actions and the results. And that, I think, has to be part of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a cultural thing, you know, and I think it's very easy to get sidetracked. I mean, I know Dickson is also interested in these issues as well, but I mean, to the extent to which vertical farms attempt to propose a radical solution to an enormous problem, I think is entirely, you know, to the good. But I do think as well that we mustn't forget that, exactly as you say, that terroir is not only about learning how to make tasty tomatoes out of a particular kind of soil. It's also about a whole way of life. It's about a tradition and so on. And now I know that people are going to say, well, you can't feed the world on slow food or on kind of, you know, tomatoes that taste like this, and we've all got other stuff to do in our lives and all the rest of it. But on the other hand, for me, one of the issues is that the possible solutions or the discussions about possible solutions always tend to get polarized about two extremes. So it's either hideous Monsanto monocultural hell, or it's the tomato that tastes like this, you know. And actually, what about all the stuff in between?
Right.
Sure.
And by the way, it's not just about producing the food, it's about who controls the distribution of the stuff,
Right.
you know. So let's not forget supermarkets, let's not forget, you know, the fact that agribusiness currently, you know, there are 3 major firms in the world that basically control the whole of global trade in grain, for instance. You know, there are these enormous companies, that Archer Daniels, Midland, for instance, who have incredible invisible power that half of us had never even heard of. But actually, you know, if you want to sort of make interventions in the way we grow and produce food, it's a political and economic issue, as in, you know, as well as a social and cultural one. I mean, the vastnesses of the problem are sort of sometimes weirdly invisible, and yet, you know, the barriers to change are those. So, sorry, I've just made 4 points in one sort of. I don't mean to do that, but I mean, I just want to say that, you know, it's not a question of is it a sort of wizened old farmer in some French vineyard doing it the way he's done it for generations, or you know, Monsanto. There's, for me, the issue is learning to sort of understand what the value of food is as a sort of cultural phenomenon, and through that, to start to see that there are all sorts of middle ways, if you like.
What are some of the other ways of integrating, other models for integrating farming into the city? I mean, my community garden, I can't grow that much. Your vertical walls.
I mean, the most
is there a place for small farms within the city, and
well,
how would that
look
be
at the way it used to
integrated?
get done historically.
Right.
I mean, you know, for me, history is sort of the future in a way, because I think, you know, the only difference between the way people used to farm sort of 500 years ago and now is oil, essentially. You know, that's the big difference. That's what allows us to sort of do things in a different way, in a way that, if you like, is against nature rather than with it. So I think that's a huge issue. I think, you know, in a post-oil society, we're going to have to start looking at the thrift, the lack of waste, the local synergies that you know, cities naturally evolved in. I mean, we were talking earlier on. I'm so sorry we keep saying we were talking earlier on today, as if we had all a really interesting chat before. But we were. I do apologise. We're trying to have it again. But I mean, we were on a radio program earlier on, so we were being asked similar questions. But we were talking about, you know, the way cities historically used to behave as ecosystems. You know, and it was absolutely necessary for a city to be in an area where there was fertile soil, or if it wasn't, to be on a river where it could import the food by river, you know, to recycle its waste, because, you know, the only way it was possible to keep the local soil fertile was by dumping your organic waste on it, and, you know, basically having, if that's the city and that's the land, to have it doing that, if you like. So it's all about organic cycles in which we take a part. And one of the ways that worked was that instead of having you know, vast metropolitan blobs, you know, that had to get their food from somewhere else, so it all becomes about food distribution. Basically, you had tiny little pockets of urbanity and tiny little pockets of farm. And Holland is the absolutely beautiful example, or the Netherlands, I should say, is the absolutely perfect historical example of this relationship, and a canal system that made it very easy to export the organic waste of all kinds, human and animal, to the land and import the food. So there are really interesting historical models.
I buy a lot of organic food here in D.C. that's grown on organic farms around the city and trucked in. Is that part of the solution or part of the problem?
No, I think it's definitely part of the solution. I mean, if it's relatively local, it's not coming from Chile or where your blueberries came from this morning. I mean, I think that is, we can't think of it in terms of these tiny, tiny little, I mean, as Caroline was saying, I think it's a system of all of these different scales, and I think there is a limit. I think it's almost like we should think smartly about, maybe it's about creating all these radii around urban centers, and that radii expands and contracts relative to the scale of the population that it's serving, and there's some overlapping of that. And what then you would end up with would be this great, fabulous quilt of farming systems that each had their own personality and their own flavors. And then, my God, it could start this whole sort of ecotourism thing, because those areas in that part are known for their potatoes and whatever. And I mean, one of the things when you were talking about Amsterdam, and I briefly mentioned this to you before we started this evening, was what's happening in Detroit right now. Because actually the urban farming organization that we're working with is based in Detroit, and she started the organization in Detroit specifically because the city is basically being dismantled, and not in a very clean way, but there are lots of open sites in that city, and it's the perfect ground for starting these kinds of farms that actually, it teaches people a skill, it makes the food locally available, it makes use of the land that is no longer being used for, traditional urban life. It brings life back to the city. I mean, Michigan is suffering tremendously because of the automobile industry. I would, and actually what's happened from that too, because a lot of people have moved out, artists are starting to buy up these houses in these neighborhoods, and they're renovating them, to be sustainable. So they're creating this unbelievably fabulous community. The potential for what that could become is pretty interesting. So I think, for example, when we have issues like Ground Zero, how many years has it been sitting there empty? I mean, personally, I don't think there should be a building there, Why not make that part of the city needs a park? Why not, when we get the opportunity to get these large tracts of land in cities, when
There's
a building...
actually a lot of schemes in Britain now where they're basically sort of making even temporarily land available and just saying, let's go and farm on this stuff, even if it's for 5 years or something.
Absolutely.
But of course, it raises the issue of scale again, because this is not solving the problem.
Also,
this is
there's a lot of public health issues, too, that I have to interject here, that we stopped using leaded gasoline in 1976. And all you have to do is dig down into the soil to find the lead. It's still there.
Yeah.
So there's some really dangerous situations that you can get yourself into by simply thinking too warm and fuzzy about what it would be like to raise a lot of food inside the city limits of Detroit, of all places, which has, I'm sure, its share of leaded gasoline leftovers. And so you really have to approach this with caution. I'm addressing different issues in this, though. My issue addresses giving land back to nature, which I don't think anybody in this audience would probably disagree with. If we could give farmland back to nature and still have food, wouldn't that be a nice thing? So, you're looking at a trout fisherman here. When I grew up in my little town in northern New Jersey, we had a fishing river that I could catch native brook trout in by simply bicycling to the next town. That's now a sewer. So you could rewrite that movie. A sewer runs through it. And I know exactly where that is because that's where I grew up. I've seen this happen all over the country because I fish wherever I go. I know what's the problem. The problem is encroachment. And encroachment from agriculture. There's no bigger encroacher in the world than agriculture, whether you want to admit that or not. The biggest polluter in the world is agricultural runoff from irrigation projects, huge, big irrigation projects. It has trashed virtually all of our estuaries. The United States imports 80% of its seafood as a result. That's a tragic figure. My grandfather was a shrimper in New Orleans. That's where I was born. He would be out of a job today if that happened. So I want to address larger issues of runoff and permanent sequestration of carbon. So if I can farm in a building, that's a small concession to me. If I can get 1 acre of indoor farming to produce 10 acres of outdoor land that I could then return to nature, wouldn't that be a good thing?
So, Dickson, are you saying that you would go out in Nebraska and stack some of your vertical farms on a Monsanto agribusiness site?
No, Nebraska was always grasslands. I won't go there. But I would go to Ohio, and I would go to other places that you pay those farmers the fair price for carbon, like you pay them for corn, and they'll do it every time. They'd be glad to farm trees. They'd be glad to be the stewards of the earth again. They'd be glad to live in a rural setting and live a sylvatic life where the furniture that you have is no veneer. That's solid walnut. That's solid cherry. That's solid oak. Those are real possibilities if we learned how to mass produce our food in some other way. We're mass producing it now, and we're mass denigrating the entire planet.
So what would the Ohio family farm look like after your vision?
I'll give you the best example. You know, this is fantastic. You want some books to read? I'll give you a book to read. Read Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac. Do you know what that book is about? It's about his abandoned family farm in Wisconsin. And why is it such a touching portrait? It's a touching portrait because it says that the land will heal itself if you let it. Why does it have to heal itself? Because we damaged it. How? By replacing the hardwood forest with crops and farmland. So we know how to do it a different way now. Not everywhere, but in a lot of places we do. I'll give you 2 more books just quick. One is A Man Who Planted Trees, great book. Real story about what one person could do to replace the environment that he doesn't like with the environment that everybody would like. And of course, the last one is The Lorax. Little kids love that book, but it's written by an adult for adults. It's meant for an adult to read that book to a kid so that the adult gets it. The kid already got it. It's us that didn't get it. So any way that I can conspire to take farmland out of farming and convert it back to what it used to be 15,000 years ago is what I'm in favor of. And
what's stopping this? It sounds as though the greenhouse technology exists.
It does.
And the money is there somewhere. Why can't we implement a prototype of what you're talking about?
We're very close to doing that, actually. If you have to ask me the question, I would say, knowing what I know, although I can't reveal all of the details, I would say based on the pressures that our group has felt from the world, and this includes groups like the United States Agriculture Department, this is USAID talking, this is OPIC, this is World Bank. They have places in mind where vertical farming would be an absolute godsend throughout the world. And once invented, I don't think you could stop it after that. And I'm not saying it should be the only way to do that.
The only thing I would disagree with that you... disagreement, yes! The only thing I would disagree with that you just said is that I think we need to be looking to return farmland, the kind of farmland that is basically farmed by... Actually, this carpet's quite a good illustration of it. But have you seen these aerial shots of the way farmland in Brazil is harvested? And they have literally combine harvesters in a phalanx, like a flight of geese, kind of flying across, but not flying, actually churning up the crop. So you've got about 30 combine harvesters in a sort of line, and then a mile back you've got another line of reapers coming to sow the next crop. So the land has downtime of about half an hour. That's the kind of farmland we need to be taking out of that kind of production. However, I don't think we should be necessarily returning it to as it was 15,000 years ago. I think we may be having to look at returning it to the way it was, say, maybe 200 years ago. So that's an interesting...
Sure. The climatologists, though, we're not addressing climate issues here. We're not talking about this. You're assuming everything is going to stay the same. And things do not stay the same. They will not stay the same. If the climate continues to change as rapidly as it is now, what we're told, where I work, is that in 100 years from now, you won't be able to farm anywhere where you can farm now.
Yeah.
In the Northern Hemisphere, you're doomed. Okay, if you're doomed, what are you going to do? Just sit there and take it? Not me.
I'll wager
Try to do
that
something.
I'll wager that someone is burning to ask a question. Yes.
We do have a microphone, so.
How does the vertical greenhouse farming compare from an energy and cost point of view to traditional forms of agriculture?
Energy. Well, traditional farming uses 20% of the fossil fuel in this country right now just to plow, to reap, and to harvest. All of those activities require huge amounts of fossil fuels. The vertical farm, I think if it's on the grid, it's a loser. You have to find out ways of using alternative energy sources in order to make it work off the grid. And that requires wind power, solar power, geothermal, tidal. I mean, there are a whole bunch of choices here, but the biggest one is to recycle the parts of the plants that you don't eat back into an energy recovery system. And we have a lot of opportunities here to take advantage of that. The traditional farmer has no opportunity at that level whatsoever. So he does get all the sunlight, or she, but the amount of energy that is wasted in farming is tremendous. You'll never find out that equation, by the way.
It seems this evening that the two kinds of farming have sort of been pitted against each other, the farming walls and the hydroponic vertical farms. And but would you say there might be a place in the future food needs in cities for both these kinds? Because some people, it'd be great for people to get to produce their own food, but then I know there's a lot of people who they're never going to want to go make their own food when they can just buy it. So it might be able to, that both of them could meet the needs of the city.
I mean, I think the word both is where you're going wrong, because I think the word should be all.
Yeah.
Because as I was trying to say earlier, there is no one answer to this. There is probably a million answers.
That's right.
And we've got to stop thinking in terms of, sort of, it's either that or that. I mean, we're wired up to think in dialogues and polarities. I mean, it goes back to the Greeks, this thing, It's basically, do you think this or do you think that? Do you want tea or coffee, And the answer is, well, I want, toffee. And we just have to, which, curiously, I quite often do when I'm asked that question, but, it's actually, for me, I mean, I've invented this word, which I would like to share with you. It is Cytopia. It's from the Greek cytos, which means food, and topos, which means place. It's an alternative to utopia, which has been used for thousands of years as a way of trying to work out how we dwell on Earth, which is the basic problem, if you like, that we're talking about tonight. And for me, Cytopia is where we live. We live in a world shaped by food. Our lives are shaped by food. It's not just how we produce it. It's, where we eat, who we eat with, what happens to the waste, blah, blah, it goes on and on and on. The fact that we break 3 times in a day for the things we currently call breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but actually 1,000 years ago, what we now call dinner was actually eaten at 10 in the morning and blah, 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 before electric light. Anyway. But, so for me, the trick we've got to pull is to learn to see how food shapes everything anyway. So see with what I call Cytopian glasses on. And then we can see that everything is part of the answer. So yes, it's vertical walls. Yes, it's vertical farms.
Sure.
Yes, it's, plants on your windowsill. Yes, it's medium-sized farms. But what it isn't is pretending that the problem of food production is just something off there that somebody else called Walmart somehow magically makes appear out of a black box, and that it's cheap, which is great, so that means you can spend more money on, I don't know what, computer games.
Right.
There is no such thing as cheap food. Cheap food, I was saying earlier in one of these conversations we keep taunting you with, but I promise they weren't any better than this. But, it should be sort of a sin to talk about cheap food. This is ethically wrong, and actually all cheap food is a misconception of what the real costs of food are. They're all externalized and invisible. So sorry that I leapt in.
Well,
and again,
tell us what some of the hidden costs are.
Well, I mean, we've been talking about them all evening, but oil is a very obvious hidden cost. Climate change, eutrophication, pollution from agricultural practices.
Tell us about the Gulf of Mexico. You were talking about the Gulf of Mexico before we started.
Well, there's lots and lots of different parts of the world where basically runoff from... I mean, the trouble with fertilizer is that basically, unless it's used in a very, very precise way, it actually overloads the ecological system. I mean, Dickson's more of an expert in this than I am, but basically you get runoff. The local ground can't absorb whatever sort of cocktail of chemicals you stick on it. It runs into the local river. All the local sort of biological systems go mad. You get algae. You get sort of fish with 4 eyes. It's like you're power pumping to do work in a gym, and then you don't do the work. You just get these hideous bulging ecological muscles, and it is a form of pollution through, basically overfeeding. I mean, it's. And these are the sorts of issues that, the bill for that probably goes on to some other sort of federal budget. It doesn't go on
to the person who eats the food.
Precisely right.
Well, but then it creates health problems.
Yeah.
And then that stresses the system,
Yeah.
and then it just goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think what is required here is almost like this master plan or a Marshall Plan for food, actually, that, again, we were talking about it was very interesting to me how Obama ran his campaign, for example, because he utilized the internet to expand his reach into places that traditionally would have been ignored. And I really do feel like if there is the will and the understanding of the critical nature of the problem here, if we were to galvanize that same kind of energy to resolve and come up with these kinds of solutions, and all of them are doable. I mean, we're sort of going back and forth, but I mean, this is a viable plan. I think, the images are huge, but it's the idea. So
is Michelle Obama's vegetable garden helping?
Absolutely. It's helping to show people that it matters. And also what's very interesting is that people start to retrain their eyes a little bit, because a landscape of farms, of ecologically responsibly grown farms, doesn't look like the mall. It's not a perfectly pristine, gorgeously green surface. It's a little messy. There's, depending on what you're growing, it can look a little wild. And so I think by having a garden at the White House, all of a sudden, here's this really nicely manicured lawn with this sort of funky looking plot there, and it's going to change over the seasons. And I think it really is, we need to re-educate people's eyes to see that, we don't have to dump all this fertilizer. Like that whole lawn thing in this country is so weird to me. And, there's a whole urban thing that we were also talking about, how people, I didn't grow up in a city. I live in a city now, and I've taught, my husband teaches, and one of the things that we've always found really fascinating is people that have grown up in the city have this weirdly different relationship to the landscape. Like, when you take them out to the landscape, they won't sit on the grass because there are bugs there. Or they think they're like weird animals in the forest, and
there are weird animals.
Not as
but
weird
here's
as
the way
ones
I
in the
feel
city.
about like lake fish and ocean fish.
I like those weird
I grew up near lakes. Like oceans,
but
like weird things.
you
that
want-
bite
you
your
want
toes. But I think
expensive farming.
it is about re-educating and exposing people to a different kind of aesthetic.
What's really interesting, I mean, 200, sorry, Dickson, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say one thing, and that was last year in July we passed a farm bill worth $300 billion. Is that real dollars to you? Is that enough? Half of it is farm aid that we grow food for other countries. We pay our farmers to grow food for other countries. The other half is farm insurance. Farm insurance. What's that? That's what you pay a farmer when their farm fails. And last year's prices were, okay, we'll pay you that much this year, and we'll pay you that next year and the year after. You get 3 years' worth of failed farms at farm insurance rates to make sure that you stay in business so that you can grow food for us some other time. That's what farm insurance, we paid for that out of our pocket. That bill was reauthorized when it was short $120 billion. They reauthorized the bill in 3 weeks, and it passed by a vote of 85 to 15. You want to see what the farm bill is, go to verticalfarm.com. It's all there. 685 pages.
You know, we started to talk about, can we talk about transportation, the transportation of food a little bit? We started to talk about that, and I remember seeing a statistic that the average piece of food travels to the consumer 1,500 miles.
That's right.
Why is that bad?
Why is it bad? Well, if you're in the oil business, that's really good. I think that's how you burn up oil getting food from one place to the next. But what also happens is you have to store it first. You have to refrigerate it. You have to. That's more oil. It spoils. It rots. You have to package it so it doesn't rot. That means you package it when it doesn't taste good.
Well, and it also feeds into our whole concept or perception of what food really is.
That's right.
Which is
and what it tastes like.
So local food
because when you start
to,
you know, when we moved to a different neighborhood in New York City and we had a green market 2 blocks away and we started buying the lettuces there, it was extraordinary. And we would buy organic vegetables at the grocery store. This is a totally different thing.
That's true.
When it's grown locally. It has a totally different flavor. It actually lasts longer in your refrigerator. And I think that's also, it's not just the pollution and all of that. It's about this whole idea of educating people about the richness of locally grown food.
Can I just link a few things together? Because I was going to say something in response to what you said, and then I could see Dickson was so sort of keen to speak. I said, but actually this all links up. So can I just give you a brief glimpse of 200 years of history and a few things that are completely tied up. One, fear of dirt. You mentioned it. 200 years ago, if you lived in a city and you ate meat, you could not have been in any doubt as to where your meat came from, because the only way of getting an animal into a city in an edible condition was for it to walk in. So basically, moo down the high street, you know. So, and of course, having got the animal into the city live, because that's the only way to get it in, you then had to slaughter it in the city. So the sight of slaughter, the smell of slaughter was everywhere. So you couldn't be scared of dirt, and people also at this time were very happy to sit at a table and have an animal, like, say, a turkey, presented to them with all its feathers on and its beak still on because the thing was cooked, and then re-presented as a live animal because that's what people wanted to see. They wanted to see that they were eating real food and it had been a good-looking animal when it was alive. So, 200 years ago, trains, all of a sudden, you know, you don't have to walk the animals into the city anymore. You can slaughter them wherever you like because you can get them in very fast and keep the meat fresh on a train. Therefore, all of a sudden, overnight, no more live animals in a city. All of a sudden, overnight as well, you get fear of the animal. You get squeamishness. People suddenly start going off the sight of a real animal on the table that they're about to eat, and they start saying, oh no, well, you know, maybe I'll go vegetarian. Actually, there was a huge surge in vegetarianism at this time. And of course, what we now have is, if you like, the worst of both worlds, which is that we eat a huge amount of meat, but we don't face up to the fact that it is meat, because we only eat the white bits or the bits that don't have eyes or knobbles or sinews in it. We export all of that to Asia, where they love all the knobbly bits, you know, and nibbling on a chicken's foot is basically what they're there to have a good time. So, I mean, I think it's all linked together. For me, the problem of distribution of food, which is, sorry, your question, is actually, it's not, interestingly, I mean, there have been a lot of researches in England done into the degree to which the distribution of food contributes to its carbon footprint, and it's surprisingly low. It's actually something like 2% out of the total carbon footprint of the UK is reckoned to be actually this business of flying beans in from Kenya. But it is all the other issues that are associated with it that are so crazy, i.e., you know, the distancing of us from what our food is. And these things have their own associated costs that ultimately build up into a crazy picture. Exactly. It's absolutely crazy the way we produce and distribute food now.
So in one of your books, you wrote that the meat consumption of the average Chinese has gone up.
Yeah.
tens of
Well,
times.
meat's a very
What's wrong
interesting
with that?
one. Well, what's wrong with it is that meat is an incredible... Well, it takes about, roughly speaking, 10 times as much grain to feed a human if it passes through a cow first. So this is clearly not a good way of feeding large numbers of people. I mean, I'd love the historical examples, but I mean, my favourite one is the first cities ever built were built in this area of the ancient Near East called the Fertile Crescent. Why? Because people began to eat grass, which is the only way you can actually feed an urban population. Grain is the food of cities, always has been, always will be, unless somebody comes up with a nutrition pill. Maybe that's going to be Dickson's next project, I don't know. But the fact is,
that was not fair.
but we're still eating grain. You know, grain is still what's feeding cities. The thing is, it's doing it through cows and chickens and pigs first, which means it's hugely un-eco, shall we say. And the amount of water, as Scott was saying in his introduction as well, you know, it takes 1,000 times as much water to produce a kilo of beef than it does a kilo of wheat. You know, so there are just huge costs in meat consumption. And of course, as we know, you know, China is doing deals with Brazil to vastly increase its soya production so the soya can be shipped over and fed to cattle, or indeed fed to cattle wherever they're produced, in order to feed this burgeoning desire for meat. So it's just a very sort of ecologically heavy way of eating. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I do think there is a place for meat in our diet, but I think it's a place where basically cows are kind of designed to eat grass, and we can't eat grass. So I think stick the cows and the sheep where they can eat stuff we can't eat, let them mow the lawn, plop their poo onto it, which fertilizes it very nicely as well, you know, which is slightly what I'm saying about let's go back to things that kind of made sense 200 years ago before we industrialized.
I saw that in the 1920s there were sheep grazing on the White House lawn.
Oh, yeah. Right. Well, I mean, that will probably...
Can we go back to that?
Yeah,
sure.
Absolutely.
Model,
yeah,
sure.
Maybe not for the White House, but for a corporate campus.
Oh, absolutely.
Michelle Obama's sheep, I can see that. Yeah. Why not? But I mean, again, it's for me, part of the value of growing food in the cities is not just, you know, the minimization of the transport costs, which is what we're sort of addressing at the moment. It's also the visibility of the food. You know, I keep coming back to this. It's actually reconnecting us with the fact that, you know, food is something precious and vital and of the natural world. And I think that's sort of what's interesting about...
Yeah. The average American has no earthly idea where his or her food comes from.
Right.
Unless it says it on the label. But I want to talk about one other thing, too, and that was the establishment of the EPA, which was established with 28 regional laboratories associated with it. And once that was found out, of course, the EPA was not disbanded, but only 2 of those laboratories were kept. Those laboratories were there to assure the quality of your food and water. Now, we can't do that now. I'm going to tell you something. The vertical farm, although it might appear not to be such a great solution here, could at least give you a printout as to what's in your tomato. And I can guarantee you that if I can control everything, the only thing that's going to be in that tomato is what the tomato needs and what you need. It will not contain pesticides or herbicides or fertilizers or heavy metals or, you know, endocrine disruptors or any of those other things. I can control this.
Okay, but how is...
That's a printout. Now, I dare say that any of you are challenged to give me a similar printout of urban-grown food in soil that has a history.
But how is that different from genetically modified food?
Genetically modified? I didn't even mention that.
But I mean, if you're controlling everything, I'm just sort of, this is interesting.
I don't want to control the
that you're
genetics.
Controlling everything.
We've already done that. No, excuse me. Do you know what the original apple looked like? You know the history of food, but perhaps you're not aware of this. It comes from central Russia. It's a little bitter fruit about that big. Do you know how many different varieties of apples there are today? 20,000 different varieties. How did that happen? We didn't genetically engineer it. Oh, yes, we did. We artificially selected them. That's genetic manipulation. I hate to tell you that. But virtually everything you eat has been genetically manipulated. Everything we've eaten. These big fat turkeys with large breast meat. These big fat fish. These big fat poultry. These big fat cows. All of them have been genetically selected by artificial selection techniques. Not in the lab. Just tell me what you want. Remember, tell me what you want. I want a chicken that can't even walk. I want turkeys that can't fly, because the breast meat is what I'm interested in. I'm a white meat eater, and therefore that's what I'm going to eat. okay, I can genetically breed a pigeon or a turkey to look like anything you'd like. Darwin proved that time and time again. You know, there's only one species of dog. There's only one species of cat. You don't call that genetic manipulation? Come on. That's
So you want
that's big time.
You want a turkey that just sits there and puts on protoplasm?
That's what we raise. That's what we want. That's how it is. So that's what you're stuck with for food. That's exactly. Unless you go out and shoot your own turkey out in the wild, which doesn't have any meat on it at all. You know why? Because it has to fly.
Anybody burning to ask a question before?
Anyone not burning to ask a question?
And you're all invited out to dinner afterwards with us.
My question is, as far as agriculture, how about food? How about non-food stuff? As for instance,
Can't hear. Sorry, can't hear.
Non-food items, for instance, biodegradable. For instance, using agriculture products for things like material, oil, or energy.
Yep.
And along with that, my next question is, what about fish farms or indoor fish farms? I read about this tilapia farm in Brooklyn, New York. So I'm wondering about that as well.
Yep.
I mean, the interesting thing about fish ponds is that, I mean, if you look at sort of cultures that have evolved, systems of farming that are sort of self-sustaining, permacultures, in other words, fish ponds, I mean, this is very sort of common in sort of areas in China. They use fish ponds as part of the sort of natural ecosystem of a whole farming system, so that basically you keep ducks on grass next to the pond, and the ducks eat the grass, and then they swim in the pond, and then they defecate in the pond, and then the fish eat the enriched, you know, they basically gain nutrients from the pond, and then the people eat the fish, and so it goes, and then you put your own manure on the land, and then you grow more grass, and you know, it's those, and also you, I mean, what's very interesting actually, and I think, I mean, I'm basically really for vertical farms, don't get me wrong, but I do think the sort of, you know, the issues that they raise are really interesting, and one is this business of monoculture, shall we call it, you know, sort of a way of farming that treats food as a commodity. And I think that's probably what a lot of the sort of where, you know, sort of Robin and I are slightly kind of challenging Dickson and sort of saying, well, actually, do we want to reduce a tomato to a beautifully engineered, you know, I mean, you know, on one level, of course we do. But on the other hand, we don't want to deny people the pleasure of creating a beautiful tomato. And all of these kind of human issues are also sort of buried in the subtext. But I know you're not saying that.
But I also think that one of the things that concerns me so much is what actually the impact that all of these ideas have on the architecture of the city and the urban sensibility of the city. Because I do think that is another part of the equation that, for me personally as an architect, you know, I think that there is a way to bring this into cities and urban areas and even suburban areas that are probably going to become closer to urban areas, and have design be an important element of it that can actually make it, sort of take it to the next level. And I do think that a lot of these ideas that Dickson students have come up with, you know, this is exactly the kind of thinking that I think does need to happen. I think, you know, to make that, I think those tend to be unique elements. You know, they're all, you know, if you look at the image, you'll notice that there's never really not a lot of stuff around it. And Dickson rightly admits that, you know, there is an issue with light. You know, if you're going to have vertical greenhouses, you need to be able to get light in order to grow all of those things properly and not use energy to make the light. Then you need to have exposure, which if you're in a city like New York City, a city of towers, or places in Chicago or other cities, it's limited where you can locate those towers. So, I mean, I think
post-fitting food into existing cities, isn't it? I mean, that's what we're talking about, really.
Yeah,
which is half of the problem. I mean, the other
half of the
is,
problem.
You know, how do we build the kind of, I'm not going to call them cities, but the dwellings or the dwelling spaces that the 3 billion people that aren't on the planet yet but are going to be by 2050 going to live. And that's an interesting one. You know, it's two separate problems, really, but I mean, they're the two halves of the same problem.
Exactly.
Well, is there any limit on a high-rise building to how far you can build a vertical farm or plant a 10-story greenhouse on top of it? Is there any height limit?
Not really.
I don't know of any. If you do, I'd like to hear about
there
it.
Wouldn't really be, I mean, really, there wouldn't be, structurally, it's completely possible. I think you're primarily limited really by, it's a light issue and also transportation of, totally sort of access and, but light is the big deal.
There's a project in England called the Eden Project that I highly recommend you're going to look at. It's made out of a very lightweight material called ethyl tetrafluoroethylene. Sounds like an awful material, but it actually turns out to be a really stunning material. It's as transparent as water, and it's tougher than nails. And for its weight, it really is the strongest material you can think of. There are 3 enormous superdome-sized geodesic domes covering a tropical rainforest in the south of England. And they're doing that to preserve those plants so that when their own environments return to somewhat normal, they can take these plants and reintroduce them. But take a look at that, because you can build very large structures, very lightweight, out of very tough materials that are totally transparent. We have the technologies here to overcome all of these objections. I wouldn't ever think of locating a vertical farm in the middle of Wall Street. That'd be the dumbest thing I could ever think of doing. No city planner would ever do that. But like I said, you've got 5 square miles of property outside of New York City, but not outside of New York City. It's in Brooklyn. It's called Floyd Bennett Air Force Base. We've got Governor's Island. Every city has these kinds of properties.
Someone over here was burning to ask a question.
Over here.
Ooh, a lot of people are burning to ask questions.
We should be talking less.
Hi, thanks. To build on all the wonderful visionary and cultural and historical context that we've gotten in this grand conversation, and tonight especially, it seems like the conversation needs to go to discussing what the metrics are to begin to test these deployments. And so specifically, as architects, what are the metrics that we need to be concerned with to develop a program for for these varied iterations of these buildings? What are the metrics required for developers? What's their metrics for pro forma? What's the metrics for planners in developing cities with this? And finally, what is as an ecologist, what are the metrics that we need to be concerned with for making sure it all results in net positive, without compromise, to the greater good?
That's right. Well, that's the whole idea about the prototypes.
Yeah.
If you can have prototypical buildings to work with and to play with, to work these out, you'll never make a mistake. But the biggest mistake I can point out to you is Biosphere 2, where that was actually a dream of someone to capture all the biomes of the world underneath one roof. And they didn't have a clue as to how to go about doing it. Metrics, they just had a lot of money. They had $200 million and they spent it on that. And look what happened. Now everybody's laughing at them. And the idea is that we shouldn't laugh at the next one. We should do as much work as we can, scientifically and culturally and planning-wise and architectural-wise, to make sure that these mistakes are not repeated. And in fact, that's how you do it. You have these models to work with. So you can sail it down to a restaurant. As I mentioned before, I'm not interested in these big buildings either. I'm interested in going to a restaurant that makes its own produce, or a school that teaches ecology through that vertical farm that's attached to it, or the hospital for the patients that are immunocompromised that have to have sterile food in order to survive past their illness.
Yeah, and actually
I'm really interested in that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point in that I think the schools are a great place for this to start, establishing the models. I mean, we partnered with Cal Poly just simply to pre-grow the walls, because we didn't want to have them initially, to install bare walls. We wanted it to be this big bang when we installed it, so they grew the walls. And any time that we go into a city, we're going to partner with probably an educational institution.
Sure.
But you have the materials and the resources available to you to actually be able to do this kind of research. But I also think it's a great idea to actually, maybe there are ways that incentives can be built into the tax system or the nonprofit system where, hospitals, schools, and community centers will all get some sort of break if they transform a part of their building into something that actually sustains. I think hospitals is a fantastic idea.
One more burning question.
See, we agreed on that one.
So many hands. Okay.
I grew up in L.A., and water obviously is a huge issue, and basically there's farm interests versus agricultural interests, and they're very distinct geographically. The question I have really is there's political, cultural, there's all kinds of formations around water in urban versus agricultural areas, and to affect some of the changes you're talking about, it seems like a lot of things have to be reconfigured in a lot of ways.
They do.
That's right.
They do. That's right. So what was reconfigured in Southern California, this was Orange County. Santa Ana, California is the epicenter for it. It's just south of Los Angeles, right? Because that's where you grew up. What did they do? They petitioned the governor for more water, and the governor said, we don't have any more water. Deal with it. But we want to grow. We're a very wealthy community. We need to grow. So they said, we make our own water. Up. He goes, up. We make black water. We make urine and feces. You know what they've done? Yes, you do, actually. They've made from toilet to tap water. It's their own water. So water is too valuable to drink only once. And in Orange County, they're now taking their black water, making gray water, taking the gray water, percolating it over the ground, and then drawing the water out of the ground, using the ground as the last filtration element to recovering every single drop of water they produce. And that's ecological. That's the way we should do it.
Yeah.
We've got one more question over here.
Yes, you mentioned two very important things to grow plants. One of them is sunlight, the other is water. And there is no mention about nutrients.
Miracle Grow. Yeah, you add the Miracle Grow yourself.
So,
plant
okay,
nutrients.
that's actually answered my question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's all available. I mean, we know how to do that. That's an easy part. And it's not even expensive. I'm not saying use Miracle Grow, but that's essentially what the greenhouse farmers actually use. A mixture of urea plus the elements that the plant needs plus the elements that we need. Plants only need 16 of those elements. We need 48 of them. We overlap. So you need to add as many as we need in order to get nutritional value out of those plants. We know how to do that. It's already being done. No fossil fuels. No. I'm against that.
We're coming to the end of a vibrant discussion, and I'm wondering what would each of you like the audience to take away from this is one kernel that they can kind of nourish. Robin, can we start with you?
One kernel is sort of hard to pinpoint, although since there are three of us, there'll be three rather large kernels.
That's right.
I mean, I think what's important is that people take responsibility for the places where they live, the cities where they live. I think one of the problems that actually we didn't touch on tonight, but I would argue that there is a really serious disconnect in terms of community these days. I think there's a huge loss of this sense of community, and that we're all in this together, and that we need one another to solve the problem. And that means collaborating with people, that means listening to other people that have ideas that might be different than ours. This administration is actually, I think it's setting a tone that I think the potential for more people realizing the significance of collaboration has a more public face. I would encourage you all to actually educate yourselves about the potentials for locating urban gardens, demanding for more responsibility in terms of where your food comes from. And it really doesn't take a huge effort. I mean, one of the, Bette Midler, for example, okay, she's Bette Midler, but one person in New York City, she started this program to save gardens like yours from developers. And, you know, you should be aware of where these gardens are, get involved with them, and take ownership of them, because they are very valuable pieces of property. And she has actually been very successful in saving a lot of these gardens, and also been responsible for getting the administration, the city administration, to be involved with the planting of 1 million trees in the city and stuff. This stuff is happening, and it can happen, but it can't happen without you. You know, it's not somebody else's responsibility, it's your responsibility. So I guess I would just encourage you all to sort of take on the challenge. And, you know, collaboration is something that, you know, has been undervalued. I think our culture tends to celebrate the individual. I mean, we've always told people, you know, own your house, own your piece of land. It's your right as an American. I think we have to start to shift our thinking, and we have to think more in terms of community. So that's my kernel.
Great.
There's an entire ear of corn.
Dixon,
it's not genetically modified.
I never mentioned that word.
I'm just giving you a hard time.
Where did you get that word?
It's because you're the scientist, you know.
Oh, I'm the target. Okay, that's fine. My kernel is the same thought that I began with, and that is that we're 7 billion strong. We use the size of South America to farm. Climate change is affecting where farming can occur. And we've got 3 billion more people on the way in another 40 years. 40 years. 40 years. What are we going to do? Something or nothing. You choose. I choose something. Anything is better than nothing. So for me, a reinvention of farming means I can think about giving land back to nature. That's what I can think about. Any way you can do that. If you can feed people by your guys' methods in the city, I'm for it. Because that saves land outside. That means you can give it back. You don't have to cut down the rainforest. So just think about behaving ecologically and sustainably in terms of food and the environment. That's all. And you'll come up with unique solutions to this that have nothing to do with what we've already talked about. I'm sure of this. But when you do come up with those solutions, please share them with us. We'd like to know. Just think about it. That's what I say.
Wonderful. Carolyn?
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar kind of kernel as you'd expect. I mean, this is not a sort of assorted box of chocolates, really. It's kind of, it's one of those boxes where it's all the same. But, largely speaking, but I think I would also finish where I began in a way, which is to say that for me, food is the one thing that we will share. It's the most important thing in all of our lives, and it's amazing how often I say that to a room full of people and they all start sort of looking slightly puzzled as if there might be something more important in theirs, and I'd like to know what it is, if there is something. But essentially, food is the thing that connects everything together. That's the way I see it. So it's not only the thing that connects, if you like, the bowl of cereal at your breakfast with a disappearing Amazonian rainforest. It's also the thing that, as I've discovered since I wrote this book, that allows architects like me to talk to health experts like Dickson and to talk to planners and politicians and sociologists and actually just ordinary people, because we all share this problem. So for me, it's learning to see through food and understand those connections. And actually, the minute you do that, you realize that it doesn't have to involve, although it'd be great if you went away and came up with a brilliant problem-solving solution, but it actually could be as simple as what you do tonight on the way home. You know, what you choose to eat and where you choose to buy it from. Because when you start to make those tiny changes in the way you think, and that gets multiplied over millions and millions of people, that's the kind of sea change we need. We need change at all levels. You know, we need governments to start thinking differently and start collaborating and all the rest of it. We need all the sort of the good stuff. But actually, it all begins with us, you know, just ordinary people, just kind of thinking about these issues more deeply. So, yes, it's the thinking thing, but also just, well, I call it seeing through Cytopian eyes, but, you know, it's just understanding how food connects, really, is my kernel.
Can I just say one more thing? I meant to say this, honest, I did. Too much cap and trade, not enough cap and gown.
Thank you all for a wonderful discussion.
If you did not, I saw a lot of hands up there, and if you did not get a chance to ask your question this evening, we filmed tonight. We're putting this up online next week, and then we will be asking for all of your questions. So we encourage you to go to mbm.org and to submit those questions that then they will answer, which is fantastic. Second thing is that the store is open, and we do have Carolyn Steele's book for sale. Thank you again to all the panelists, and we'll see you again soon.